McGonigal here with Bob Flounders for our usual Thursday noon live show. Hope everyone listening joins in the chat and drops us some questions as we go throughout this podcast. But if not, if you're listening after the fact or watching after the fact, know that you can spend your lunch with us Thursdays at noon here with the Blue White Breakdown. Bob filling in for Max Ralph today. I believe Max is hitting up a Pirates-Cubs game out in Pittsburgh. He's a big Cubbies fan. So, Bob, you graciously stepped in after we talked on Monday. How you been since then?
I'm good. Weird stuff happened at the Pirates-Cubs game on Wednesday night. I don't want to go into too many details, but that was a pretty wild scene. I would just say, hey, Johnny, we usually do it on Mondays at noon, and that's the first day after the weekend. I highly encourage some of the Penn State fans, if they're going to spend lunch with us on Thursday. I don't know. In my book, sometimes that starts the weekend. If they're having any kind of lunch, they could even have a liquid lunch if they want to and enjoy the pod with us. But we have a lot to get to. It's still a very interesting time for Penn State, even though they're not practicing. Right? There's some movement afoot. There might be some moves still to be made. James Franklin's talked about that, but I believe we're going to talk about specifically one side of the depth chart, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting time, like you mentioned. Spring ball is over. Blue-white game in the rearview mirror. On Monday's podcast, we dove more into standouts from the blue-white game, the experience there, the wind that everyone endured. Jackson Smollett, Ethan Grunkmeyer, like a lot of topics from the blue-white game and spring ball were hit on Monday. But Bob, I wanted to just use this episode to dive into some depth chart conversations around both the offensive and defensive sides of the ball. Penn Live readers, subscribers, if you haven't checked it out yet, I published projections, depth chart projections for both sides of the ball on Penn Live. The offense went up first on Wednesday. Defense went up this morning on Thursday. But I figured, Bob, we'll just go position by position here and just kind of talk about what Penn State has working for it right now after the spring portal is closed, but it's to new entrants. But we know that Penn State is still in the market for maybe one or two positions from the guys who are already in there. For the most part, the roster is set. There's not another portal unless you're a grad transfer that you can enter anytime. There's not a fall or August portal where undergraduates can bounce. So this is pretty close to what the roster is going to look like for the 2025 season, Bob. And I say we just start a quarterback, start off the top and work our way down.
Johnny, who are you going to go with there? This is a little bit intriguing to me. Who do you have at the top of your depth chart?
It's really difficult. On one hand, you do have a quarterback who, could go in the first round, former 5-star, could enter his third year as a starter. I was literally just about to say, we're going to spend more time on some positions as opposed to others. Yeah. Quarterback is one that we're not going to spend much time on the starter. Drew Aller coming back. He's the guy, right? He's the guy. But the intrigue for me is where the backup spot is. And it's something that we've talked about at length. But, Ethan Grunkmeyer, Jackson Smollett coming off that injury that forced him to miss all of last season. This is a position, a battle, backup quarterback that is meaningful because we've seen Bo Prabula need to step in at times over the last 2 seasons. Now he's at Missouri. And it's also a battle that we think is going to go, at least James Franklin said it, down to the wire.
Yeah, and, it's funny. We touched on it on Monday, but, I think let's just pencil, not pen. Let's pencil in Drew as the starter. But the thing that to me that is so interesting is just how the blue-white game played out. And if Ethan Grunkmeyer and Jackson Smollett stood side by side and you just looked at them and you just watched them throw the ball, whether it was at a practice session or in pregame warmups, this would be probably one of the more easier backup jobs to anoint somebody. It would be Ethan, right? But college game has changed. In the era of the spread offense, mobility is very important. Quarterbacks now come in all different shapes and sizes. Drew is the classic prototype, pocket quarterback for a pro style offense, 6'5", 235. But if you look around, a lot of quarterbacks are a lot closer to 6 feet, and they have to be able to throw on the run. They have to be accurate. It's getting the ball out quick, getting the ball in space. What I'm saying is Jackson Smolik is not your classic looking quarterback. He's also coming off a significant injury, and it was only the spring game. They weren't allowed to be hit, but he looked pretty good, running the offense, making some throws on the run. He had a long touchdown pass, I believe, to Lyric Samuel. Not that Grunkmeyer didn't do some good things either, but I thought the competition was over before it started, when they began spring drills. But James talked about it afterwards. I don't think it's set in stone. I do think he wants to play out anyway because he's trying to keep everyone happy. But it's starting to feel like a true number 2 QB competition. I still think it's Grunkmeyer. It just might be a lot closer. And it only takes an injury, like Jackson, like the one that Jackson had, to kind of upset the apple cart. But I do feel like I want to give Jackson Smolik a shout out for maybe it would have been easier. I think it probably would have been easy for him to maybe get discouraged, maybe mentally, or just kind of think like, why, what's the point? But James talked about it. He said he had a good spring, and he definitely had a nice blue-white game.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been easy for Jackson Smolik to enter the transfer portal.
Yeah.
It would have been easy for him coming off that injury, just looking at Ethan, who was, as heralded, as highly touted as a quarterback can be in the recruiting process. And then he ultimately was the backup quarterback during the CFP when Bo left via the transfer portal. So it would have been easy for Jackson just to bail, especially in the current age of college quarterbacks, and go look for an opportunity elsewhere to play early. But I think both these quarterbacks, and this is something to keep in mind, I think what they're keeping in mind is obviously the backup battle being important for 2025, but 2026 as well, because this roster, they're going to lose a lot. You wrote earlier this week, Bob, about how big their 2026 NFL draft class is projected to be. But this is still one of the top programs in the country, and they're going to be really good probably in 2026. And this is the chance for one of these two guys to be the starting quarterback at Penn State a year from now. And so something to keep in mind for both of those guys, as if they aren't already. Running back, we know who's going to start the co-starters. Nick Singleton, Kyron Allen. Would be surprised if they don't have 90% of the carries on the season. That's barring injury. Singleton was nicked up last year, during the middle of the season, the heart of the Big Ten slate there. Started with the Illinois UCLA games.
Yeah.
He dealt with some things there. But for the most part, over their 3 years, both guys have been very healthy, very, fortunate with injuries and everything, and have been productive as a result. It's behind them that it gets really muddy, Bob. And I don't know if we got much clarity from spring ball, to be honest with you. You got Quentin Martin, Corey Smith is redshirt freshman, Cam Wallace, who had a serious injury to start really last season. And he showed up late during the spring, not like literally showed up, but got on the field in the recovery process late in spring ball. So that was a good sign. You got true freshman Tyke Hayes, who has impressed the coaching staff as an early enrollee, and then Imhotep's Jabri Wallace-Coleman coming in the summer. So you're going to have 7 scholarship running backs, and 4 of them are going to be competing for number 3 duties. Wouldn't be surprised if that gets split up a little bit, but how do you kind of see this situation as it stands?
I think just moving forward, a couple things. The time of the 250 to 300 carry, 25 carry a game running back is over. It really is. Penn State had started to get away from it during Franklin's time, but they had when you have Saquon Barkley or you have Miles Sanders or you have Journey Brown, it's hard to not feed those guys the ball. But what changed was Singleton and Allen both coming in 2022 ready to go early as freshman running backs, and they kind of forced out some veterans who saw the writing on the wall. They were the best players, but it was they both had to play. They both do different things. They're both uniquely talented, and they're both they're going to play at the NFL level. I'm really curious to see. Singleton could leave Penn State as the all-time leading rusher. That's not a stretch. So could Kyron. Singleton's probably is closer to Evan Royster. But I just think it's going to be. I think James knows he's going to need three. He's going to need three running backs. Because one of them's probably going to get hurt. So it's a two-back system. To me, the most interesting guy that you mentioned behind Singleton and Allen for me is Corey Smith, only because of the players, and James has said it. He's a little bit different than the running backs kind of on the roster. He's not the biggest guy, but he's really quick. Very very slippery. He had the longest, I think, play of the 2024 season, that 78-yard run against Washington. They wanted to redshirt, all of those guys. Wallace got hurt. I still don't know what to make of Quentin Martin. He sure looks the part of a Big Ten running back. I'm very curious about Hayes, who did some nice things in the blue-white game. But I'm just curious how they're going to make this work. The good news is early in the season, those first three games, the issue should be decided, I think, early in the second half. And I think Penn State would be wise to take a look at a number of these guys. But I kind of think what happens on the practice field in August and during the season is going to go a long way towards establishing the pecking order for the future of the Penn State running back position, because they're going to be in the Big Ten. They're not going to be able to take Singleton or Allen out, in many Big Ten games. So the guy who practices the best and the guy who makes the most of his opportunities is probably going to be the guy to beat out. But they are certainly they have a lot of options behind these two. The guy that really I'm just really curious to see about Corey Smith. He needs to get bigger. If you look at him on the roster, they list him at, I think, less than 180 pounds. You have to be at least 190 pounds, I think, to have some kind of role in a Penn State running game in a Big Ten, with a Big Ten schedule. He's the guy that I'm most curious about, but that doesn't mean that somebody else can't grab the bull by the horns. Because if you look at the history of the running back position the last couple of years, when there were some years in 2020 and 2021 where they really didn't have a lead back. They got to find one, and they're going to continue to recruit the position. So there's a lot of scholarship kids here at running back, but absolutely it's going to be a different room next year. And I don't know how they're going to handle who the top two are, but I do think that Stan Drayton is the serious running backs coach, and he's pretty demanding, and I do think you're going to see one or two guys emerge.
Yeah, I just to build off of that, a few points before we move on to some other positions. But Cam Wallace was the number 3 last year. That was with Javon Sider as the running backs coach. You mentioned Stan Drayton. When Sider left for Notre Dame, Drayton came in, has offered a fresh perspective for not only Nick and Kyron, which as veterans I think goes a long way, but these guys behind him. And he hasn't seen a lot of Cam Wallace because he missed the majority of spring camp. And then one other thing you mentioned too, Nick Singleton, Kyron Allen in the same boat as Drew Aller. This is their last year at Penn State. So when these guys, Quentin, Corey, Cam, even Tyke, even Jabri, when he comes in the summer, these guys are going to be competing with an eye to 2026. And I think that's part of the reason why, if one or two of them wanted to enter the portal, maybe, after Nick and Kyron decided to come back, which I think both of them coming back was a bit of a surprise at the time. Mm-hmm. I think the allure of starting at Penn State as a running back in 2026 is a big draw for these guys. So something to keep in mind there as well. Bob, we talked so much all offseason about wide receiver. We spent so many podcasts talking about wide receiver. Before we dive into wide receiver, just want a quick plug. Yeah. Because the Blue White Breakdown, we got high school, we got a lot of things covered here on the sports side of Penn Live. We also have an investigative team, Josh Vaughn, the work that they're doing and what they already did with Death County, PA. Very, very good. So if you haven't already, check that out when that pops up on your feed, because Josh is great and everything that they've done is awesome. Really, really good. Wide receiver. Where do you want to start? You want to start with 3 new guys coming in and a complete new collection of targets for Drew Aller? I mean, it was a complete overhaul.
But honestly, I mean, it was something that had to happen. The 2024 group at the top just wasn't good enough. It wasn't all their fault. There were some other issues in some big games, but they couldn't get open consistently enough against good secondaries. It showed up in 2023. It showed up again in 2024. They had their moments, but they didn't have any moments at all in the two biggest games of the season, Ohio State, and then the damning display against Notre Dame in the college semifinal when none of them caught a pass. They were targeted, but they couldn't get open. The game's defining play, part of it was on Drew for throwing that ball, but at no point on that interception was Omari Evans anywhere near open. He's gone. Harrison Wallace is gone. They have, I don't want to say hired guns, but they have brought in some guys with some pretty impressive credentials, all different body types from all over the country, right? From all walks of life. The latest is Trebor Pena, who projects as a slot receiver, the kid from Syracuse, who put it all together for 1 year, which is it's a little concerning that it was just 1 year, but he had a heck of a year, 84 catches. Devonte Ross is the speedster who lit up Iowa last year at Iowa City from Troy. Not the biggest guy at all. Maybe a KJ Hamler or even a Jahan Dotson type of player that if you get him the ball in space and you miss, good luck catching him. But you could say the same thing about Omari Evans. I think this guy is a little bit more well-rounded, though, as a wideout. And then Kyron Hudson, a different body type. Penn State saw him last year. USC spread the ball around to like 4 wideouts and that running back Woody Marks, so there was no really a feature receiver. But Hudson, when he got the ball, was a problem. Big-bodied, could kind of use his body almost like a tight end to get open. So different body types. We talked, I think, about it on Monday. I like Tyseer Denmark. I know you really like him as well, and I think he's going to help this team. But it's hard to imagine if Pena, Ross, and Hudson are healthy, they should be Penn State's top 3 receivers. That's not to say that they're going to be in a lot of 3 receiver sets with what they have at tight end. But when Penn State wants to throw the ball, they can do it. They can do it a lot of different ways to a lot of different players. And when you're all in, these guys have to get assimilated very quickly, especially Pena. But there's not a lot of time to do it. I almost think the early September schedule is really favorable to these guys, and I think it buys them almost a second summer, if you will, to get up to speed with Drew and the other quarterbacks, because by the time they face Oregon, these guys are all going to have to be on the same page, and they're going to have to make plays in the biggest games. They have to play against the Iowa defense. They have to play against the Ohio State defense, and Oregon's going to be no fun at all when they come to State College. So this is a big investment. They're going all in, and at least 2 of these 3 these transfers are going to have really good years for Penn State to make a deep run.
I would be surprised if these aren't your starting 3 wide receivers, come the fall. You mentioned the investment, quite literally what Penn State made in these 3 guys, pulling them from the portal. They did it with intent. We knew even after adding Hudson and Ross in the winter transfer portal that they were going to be aggressive again in the spring portal. Pat Kraft told us so. He said the quiet part out loud in February when he said it's not a secret. We need a receiver. And Pena, 84 catches, 941 yards in a pass-happy Syracuse offense last year that had Kyle McCord as the quarterback. He goes to the NFL, and there's some question marks there. So Pena enters the portal and immediately becomes one of the more sought-after players in the spring. I would be very surprised if these 3 aren't your starters off the rip. But Tyseer Denmark, the progress that he made and the talent that he's shown in spots, in flashes, he's going to have to do it more consistently. But I believe he can be a difference maker for this team this fall as a second-year player. Just a couple of other names to keep in mind, guys who are projecting as reserves, but at the same time, who knows, right? Like these Marcus Hagan's wide receivers coach, James Franklin, Andy Kotelnicki, they're going to play the best guys at receiver. They can't screw around with like, oh, you have seniority, you have whatever. Like, Kobe Howard, a freshman, Lyric Samuel, you mentioned him earlier in the pod, showed some nice things in the spring game. Even Jeff Exener coming in as a late enrollee, as a true freshman. A few names to keep in mind. One of the biggest things with this offense, though, Bob, and we've talked about it ad nauseum, is, and it plays into the wide receiver, why going out and getting wide receiver was so important was, you lose your top target, you lose your top receiver in the tight end, in Tyler Warren, over 100 catches, 1,200 yards, 8 touchdowns. And it's not even, it's obviously the production, but it's also just the presence.
Yeah.
He masked a lot of deficiency. The deficiency at wide receiver, like Tyler Warren, did a really good job of covering up that with a Band-Aid and becoming that guy for Drew Aller. He's gone. And at tight end, you've got the pipeline going, and you've got some like really talented guys in that room. Luke Reynolds, Khalil Dinkins has been waiting his time. Do you think it's going to be the Luke Reynolds show? Because I have a feeling it might be.
I think it's going to be a lot of 2 tight end sets just because of Dinkins' value. I just think that Dinkins, he's got another level that he can get to. Like, I mean, he's a guy that is always going to be open because he's going to be the afterthought in coverage. But Luke Reynolds, before he kind of was dealing with a I think a limit, it was a minor injury is what I've been told in spring. He sure looks like a Big Ten tight end. I do think I'm a little intrigued about Rapplier coming off the injury, because if they have 3 tight ends, we can see that T formation that we both like a lot, Johnny. But Rapplier, before he got hurt, was really the future of the position, I think, even more so than Luke, because Luke was just a 230-pound freshman last year. I would say that this, when you think about Tyler Warren's year last year and how important tight end can be for a team that wants to run the ball, and they also have some identity issues at wideout. Penn State loses 2 more games last year, if not for Tyler Warren. The one that everyone knows about is the USC game, but they lose to Bowling Green, Johnny. If you go back and look what he did in that game, that was a very tight game. They had him on the ropes. The wideouts weren't that big of a help, I think, in that game either. They probably lose that game as well, and so they do need. They're going to have to spread the wealth at tight end, and I do believe that Reynolds is going to take a step forward. The other thing I think, though, is the offensive line, and just Kotelnicki in year 2, knowing exactly what he has. This really should not be a high-volume passing game, right? If Penn State is throwing the ball 30-plus times a game, something's probably wrong. They should be able to live with that running game, just imposing its will, because when you look at the season, once it kind of all came together, when it was Maryland, then it was Oregon, and then they ran it in the cold on SMU. They ran it on a pretty good Boise State defense, and they ran it on Notre Dame. They had over 200 yards. It wasn't the running game's fault. I look for that to continue, because this offensive line is going to be better, I think, even this year, and I do think that they can take over games. I really believe they can. And I don't know how much they have to ask this passing game to do in most of the games, but they're going to have to deliver in 3 or 4 of them. And these wideouts and these tight ends, when they're called upon, when it's 3rd and 5, somebody's going to have to get open. And it's not really about, I think, the quantity of catches this year, because we're talking about Tyler at 104. But it's going to be the quality of the catches, and it's going to be what happens on 3rd down. And it's not just about the tight ends and the wideouts. It's about Drew too. Drew needs to play better against the better defenses he's going to see. I think he can do it, but he still has to show it. He has to show it to me. The NFL is watching. He's got all the ability in the world, but I like this tight end group. I think Penn State really likes this tight end group. But I'm trying not to get too hung up on Tyler's stats, but he was an incredible player. But I do think there's more balance in the passing game, and I do think if Rapplier is healthy, the depth of the tight end room is going to be a major, major upgrade, I think, for this offense.
Absolutely. No, and one thing you mentioned there, the balance, I think this group has a better chance of being a better balanced offense this year than it was last year. It's not often that a tight end like Tyler Warren comes around, so it makes sense, but it's not really rare for an offense in college football to run through a tight end. That's not going to happen this year. But I think it's going to be for the betterment of the overall unit and its effectiveness. And I think that points to Aller's development. I think that points to the offensive line, even taking a step from where it was last year, which I thought was pretty good.
Yes.
And in the obvious improvements at wide receiver, at least what we think will be obvious improvements at wide receiver. Bob, offensive line, bring back the entire unit minus Sal Wormley, slot Cooper Cousins in there. Slot Cooper Cousins in for Sal Wormley. It's as easy as that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, it's hard to count on him, but JB Nelson will be missed. I think it was going to be a legit competition at one of the guard spots, probably between him and Cooper. But I think Cooper's time was coming sooner rather than later. But, injuries are going to happen. If you just look at what happened last year, Nelson, I think, Donko, a couple of these guys are going to get dinged up. So their depth pieces are going to have to be able to count upon them. But I think a couple of the backups too are worth talking about. But when you look at the group in general, it's really hard to. They're all such different stories. If you look at every one of their top 6 or 7 linemen, they all have a different kind of storyline. I think, to me, it's easy to focus on who I think is their best player in Venga. By the way, I was talking to him for a magazine story earlier this week, and I apologized to him because I've been pronouncing his last name wrong, horribly wrong, for most of his career. Wasn't even close. It's Ioane. And I've been calling him like Ione. I said, man, he was gracious about it, but I pledged that I'm not going to get it wrong this year. I think he is clearly their best player. I think if he takes another step, I think we can be talking about him in the first round next year. I think he's that good. He's dropped some weight. But the two guys I wanted to talk about maybe the most are Nick Dawkins and also Nolan Rucci, because at the start of 2024, no one was really talking too much other than James about Nolan. And I think people were kind of holding their breath about Nick. Yeah, that a first-year starter in his 5th year, but he was buried behind 2 NFL centers. But those guys were fantastic when Penn State needed them to be. I think Nick Dawkins, I think he can improve. I think Nolan Rucci is now an NFL tackle, and he doesn't necessarily look like Anthony Donko or Cooper Cousins or Ioane in terms of his physique, but man, he was very, very good when he started. I think it's a fantastic assortment of top-level linemen. I think you have to give Troutwine a lot of credit. I wonder, when we're talking about the offensive line, I wonder how much they're going to miss Frank Leonard, who's no longer helping Phil kind of develop the team. But we also could talk about some backups. But this, to me, even with JB Nelson no longer in the picture, as much as the top 2 running backs are good, that corner room is seriously good too. That's a topic for another day, Johnny. I still think this is the best unit of the team going into the season if there's no injuries.
Yeah, it's absolutely a strength, and I've mentioned it before, but it's such a compliment to Phil Troutwine to see what he's been able to do with this unit over the last few years. When every time the spring game rolls around, I always think back to early in the Franklin era when they couldn't even put together, like, they didn't have the numbers for 2 offensive lines. Now it's like they've got, you lose JB Nelson to the portal. That hurts from a depth standpoint. That hurts from a competition standpoint, but it's not crippling at all. It's not a crippling loss unless you just get ravaged by injuries up front next season, which, knock on wood, that won't happen to those guys. Venga is one that he's such a tone setter in there. And I know that, like, people love, and I know we love, like, watching the press box when, he gets sent in motion and he gets all these little weird things going on. But if you just watch him on a snap by snap by snap basis, the way that he controls his spot, the way he the way he dominates. I mean, he reminds me a little bit of Tyler Booker, the guard from Alabama that I know your Cowboys just drafted in the first round. Not saying that Venga's going to be a top 15 pick this time next year, but there's a first round ceiling for him. There's a first round ceiling on Cooper Cousins, like way down the line. I know that's getting a little ahead of our skis, but I think the interior of this offensive line is going to be really, really good. I think that competition at right tackle is the one that we're all going to be waiting to see what happens between Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donko, provided that Donko recovers fully from the injury that he suffered towards the end of last season. And without Nelson, a name that kind of dropped off the radar after he was such a highly recruited prospect, but should not drop off the radar now or be off the radar, is Javen Williams from Wyomissing, because Nelson leaves. I think Javen, who has worked at both guard and tackle in practice, could be that swing guy. If something happens or that someone needs a breather, you could plug Javen in there and he could provide you with an instant boost. Talking about the depth chart too, like I think if something ever happened to Nick Dawkins, it would be interesting to see what would happen, because I think from a just straight up position, like Dominic Rulli might be your backup center. Yeah. But I think they would just slide Venga or slide Cooper over to center and then figure that out from there. So that's the depth chart outlook for the offensive line. That's a depth chart outlook for the offense. Bob, we're at a half hour here. Do we want to get into defense now, or do we want to save it for Monday? What do you think?
I think the defense, especially because of some of the players that have popped, and especially because Jim Knowles is in his first year, the mad scientist, the crazy professor. There's just so much to talk about, I think, with Knowles, his defenders of the day, who he has singled out to me is fascinating. I think that we're doing the defense justice by devoting a whole Blue White Breakdown podcast to them. I just wanted to say two more names I'm really curious about on the offensive line. A couple of January enrollees, I think, are on the fast track to play early at Penn State. I hope I'm getting this guy. I've heard nothing but outstanding things. I hope I'm getting his last name right. Owen Alistini, the true freshman. He's like 6'7", worked on the blue team at tackle. He's 6'7". Owen, I'm going to get this pronunciation down. He looks like a player. Also, Michael Troutman as well. Franklin had some good things to say about both of them. A couple of veteran players mentioned Owen really without prompting about guys who have really impressed them. So those two, it's maybe not their time yet, but I think at this time next year, we're going to be talking about both of them, because there's going to be a lot of turnover on these starters. But yeah, Johnny, this offense is fascinating for so many different reasons. And Drew Aller is maybe the biggest reason, and he might be, the guy that's probably could go in the first round. But he still is a guy that is not without his questions. But really, those questions it's just a matter of seeing it from him, because there's no doubting his skills. But I think this offense, it's compelling at every position. I feel the best about the offensive line, but absolutely, Johnny, the whole defense, missing Abdul Carter and a couple other key players, deserves a Blue White Breakdown podcast of its own.
I agree. Couple more names to toss in at offensive line, and then we can open it up if there's anyone that maybe we didn't spend enough time on that you feel like we should dedicate a minute or two. But a couple more names on the offensive line. TJ Shanahan, the Texas A&M transfer. He's more of an interior guy, has starting experience at A&M in the SEC. So if we're looking at, if injuries happen or they just want to limit reps, especially early in the season, he's a guy who could fill in. And then you talked about the two early enrollee freshmen that have been standing out, and Owen and Troutman. Malachi Goodman, another name to keep in mind as he enrolls after, now that spring is over. He's a summer or, late spring enrollee, a guy who every school in the country wanted in the 2025 recruiting class. And, it's difficult for true freshmen to play as offensive linemen, especially when you've got the talent and depth that this group has, but just a name to know for the future. Bob, any name, anything, a tight end, wide receiver, running back, quarterback, any guy that you feel like we didn't spend enough time on? I've got one or two more, but I want to hear you.
I'll give you two. I like, as always, I like just kind of covering James, who's in his 12th year. I don't think James blows smoke when he talks about players that have impressed him or impressed the staff, or he's gotten feedback from coaches. He usually, when he mentions somebody, I know we're living in the age of the portal, and you got to try and smooth things over for a lot more players. But if he goes on for a while when he's asked about somebody, it's usually an indication that this player is either flashed as a true freshman or he's turned the corner maybe midway through his career. The two names I just want to bring up, one is Alex Birchmeier, who was Jaden Williams' classmate. He was, I don't know how to put it. He was kind of missing in action first couple of years. I don't know if he was dealing with some physical issues, but he was. If you look at the recruiting rankings, he wasn't that far below Javen, and not that Javen still has some things to prove too. But they were kind of 1 and 1A. But it was Donko, right? It was Donko, the guy that emerged. So I'm curious. I'm curious about Birchmeier and what he can do this year. James is very complimentary of him. I think he said the light came on. Different player, kind of took everything, everything that he needs to do, practice better. Take care of your body, all that stuff. Just a little curious about him, and just from a big picture standpoint, because he was such a coveted recruit. He's not big enough yet. Andrew Olesh, January enrollee. They list him at 220. Hopefully, he's a little bit bigger than that now. But he was a guy that one of the top tight end recruits in the country from the Lehigh Valley, Johnny. So I'm always going to talk about these guys, but they've done such a great job recruiting tight ends, identifying the tight ends that can help them, and then developing the tight ends. It shows up on draft day. They really like him. It's hard to say how long it's going to take him to kind of emerge. But if Luke's going to be around for a while. Rappleyea is going to be around for a while, but Khalil's time here is limited. I'm curious to see, maybe by the end of August, what they list Andrew at, because the sooner he can get to 230, 235 in that range, I think the more Penn State can start to really get him ready to be a player at Penn State in the Big Ten Conference, because you just can't play at 225 pounds unless you have to, unless you're forced to, like Mike Gesicki when they forced him to play because they didn't have anyone else. They need to get him up in weight. I'm curious to see what he's going to weigh maybe by the time summer ends.
Andrew Olesh was one of my two guys, so you swiped him. But you know what? This actually leads into a question we got in the chat, so that's perfect with the tight ends. And we talk all about the pipeline and Andrew not necessarily having to step in right away and play because they have such depth there and talent there. We got a question from Michael. How are they going to use both tight ends, 12 personnel? That would be my guess as well. I mean, one running back, 2 tight ends, 2 receivers. You got Aller in your offensive line out there. But don't count out like Andy Kotelnicki, mixing things up big time. And how, like, what that 12 personnel will look like. Like the literal personnel might be 12, but at the same time, it could be 2 inline tight ends. It could be Luke Reynolds is split out wide and Khalil is in line. Like they're gonna, and that's not like uncommon necessarily, but I think Andy is going to mix and match. And also, one thing to add, I think they're going to mix and match the receivers quite a bit, because I think Pena does slot in as a true possession slot. Like that's kind of what he was for Syracuse, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Devonte Ross operating out of the slot. We saw him take a couple of jet sweeps, like that kind of quick hitter stuff. Even if they wanted to maneuver Hudson or a bigger body like Reynolds out of the slot and create mismatches over the middle, I think this offense is going to be multiple look. We know that they're going to run the ball, but I think it's going to be still with the window dressing and everything else that Andy Kotelnicki does. Worth mentioning, his second year now as Penn State's offensive coordinator. That should help Drew Aller. That should help everyone that were holdovers from last year's offense. Bob, one more name I just want to throw out, talking about wide receivers, a guy that we didn't mention, Peter Gonzalez.
Yeah.
Who has the prototype body you want, big target, NFL genes. His dad was a quarterback at Pitt and played in the league. Peter had, a pretty bad injury. He had a serious long-term injury that he suffered last summer. And so he was limited working back from that. But still, like, garnered some pub from the coaches during winter workouts as a guy who's putting in the work. And, he might not contribute right away this season as a second-year player. But I'm just telling you, the talent is there. The work ethic is there. The way that he got his offer from Penn State, he had to earn it, where everyone obviously earns it. But he suffered a serious knee injury in high school at Central Catholic out of Pittsburgh. And he had offers, but they weren't greenlit offers from a lot of these schools, including Penn State. And he came to a camp and proved himself and earned it on the spot, and worked himself back. So just a guy that I wanted to highlight. And there's a lot of guys to highlight. There's going to be a lot of guys to highlight on the defense, Bob, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. On Monday's show when we hop on, because there's a lot to dive into Jim Knowles' defense. But I'm glad you're able to hop on with me today.
Sure.
I hope Max enjoys the Cubs game. For any Pirates fans out there listening or watching, I hope Max doesn't enjoy the Cubs. So we'll see how that plays out. But thank you everyone for listening. As always, you can check our stuff out on Spotify, Apple, everywhere you get your podcast. Stay with us on YouTube. These Thursday shows are regular activity, regular exercise we love to do. So thanks for listening and watching as always.